Modern psychology often looks at human distress as an equation to be solved. We look for a chemical imbalance, a cognitive distortion, a clinical pathology to cure. But existential psychology asks a different question entirely. What if the sheer, raw experience of existing is exactly what hurts? Where a clinical model treats despair as a passing mood or a medical anomaly, the existential framework views it as something structural. In 1849, Soren Kierkegaard published a text called The Sickness Unto Death. He laid out a radical diagnosis for human suffering. To Kierkegaard, the sickness unto death is not a biological disease with a terminal end. It is an agonizing spiritual state. It is the condition of wanting to be rid of yourself, but being unable to die. To understand how modern psychology approaches the mechanics of anxiety, we must look through Kierkegaard's lens. We have to treat despair not as a medical defect, but as a foundational consequence of human freedom. Kierkegaard is widely considered the progenitor of the existential movement. He was an outsider who intentionally avoided the rigid academic structures of his day. Writing in 19th century Copenhagen, he developed a new vocabulary for the human condition. These ideas lay mostly dormant before becoming the bedrock of modern psychoanalysis. To diagnose the exact pathology he called despair, we are going to physically map Kierkegaard's structural model of the self. But before we can build that model, we have to completely tear down the towering objective philosophical systems that dominated his era. In the 1840s, intellectual life was saturated by the work of G.W.F. Hegel. His dialectical system was the inescapable totalizing framework for understanding reality. Hegel operated on a core assumption that all of human existence and all of history operates like a perfectly rational machine. Every contradiction could be logically mapped and resolved. In this system, opposing forces merge. The machine mediates every tension, folding it upward into a single unified totality that Hegel called absolute spirit. Kierkegaard looked at this massive architecture of logic and found a fatal omission. A perfectly objective system has zero capacity to account for subjective human passion, or dread. He countered with the concept of the existing individual. This is the messy, irrational reality of a person forced to make choices. You cannot calculate or synthesize the lived experience of making a hard decision. When you force the raw, breathing individual into a pristine mechanism of absolute logic, the gears violently jam. Human existence demands stringent, unmediated choices. Because of this, an existential system is a contradiction in terms. It is impossible. With the grand systems cleared away, Kierkegaard starts his psychology from absolute zero, the isolated human subject. In The Sickness Unto Death, he delivers a highly precise definition. The self is a relation that relates itself to itself. That sounds like a riddle, but it is an architectural blueprint. The self is not a static noun. It is an active, continuous verb. This relation spans two opposing poles. On one end is the finite, our physical bodies, our historical circumstances, our strict limitations. On the other end is the infinite, our unbounded freedom, our imagination, and our potential. The self does not exist at either pole. It only exists in the active tension of pulling those two extremes together. Because the self is an active balancing process rather than a permanent object, it is structurally fragile. It is inherently vulnerable to collapse. Before we diagnose exactly how that collapse happens, we have to identify the baseline emotional tonality of the structure. That tonality is anxiety. In his earlier texts, Kierkegaard laid the groundwork for this by treating anxiety, or dread, as a direct psychological response to freedom. He draws a sharp line between fear and anxiety. Fear has a specific target. It requires an inner-worldly object, like a physical threat you can point to and avoid. Anxiety, however, is completely indefinite. It is the reaction to the groundlessness of existence itself. You are not anxious about a specific hazard. You are anxious about the sheer volume of possibilities before you. Kierkegaard called this the dizziness of freedom. It is the vertigo we experience when we look into the void of the future and realize that no one else can write the script. We must choose our own essence. In this framework, anxiety is not a weakness. It is the inescapable friction of possessing absolute freedom. This brings us back to the architecture. If the self is a working relation, then despair is a misrelation. It is a structural failure to balance the finite and the infinite. Kierkegaard identifies two primary pathologies where this balance breaks down. The first is defiance. Defiance is the act of hubristically willing to be oneself. The individual tries to act as the absolute author of their own existence, severing their connection to any higher ground or physical limitation. This is an overinflation of the infinite. The person becomes consumed by grand potentials and abstractions, resulting in a self that vibrates apart, completely disconnected from reality. The second manifestation of the misrelation operates in the exact opposite direction. This is evasion. Evasion is willing not to be oneself. Terrified by the dizziness of freedom, the individual collapses into the finite. They flee into the safety of the crowd, adopting whatever behaviors and beliefs are handed to them. Kierkegaard diagnosed this as the spiritlessness of the present age. The individual simply refuses the burden of choice, becoming a cipher, a generic participant in society rather than an actual self. Whether through arrogant inflation of the infinite or cowardly collapse into the finite, despair is ultimately the self refusing its own architecture. So how does existential psychology propose we cure the structural sickness? As we established with Hegel, you cannot solve a misrelation through objective logic. You cannot dialectically mediate your way out of despair, and you cannot simply think harder to fix it. Kierkegaard's solution requires stepping entirely outside of reason. He calls it the qualitative leap. The leap requires a passionate, subjective commitment. It is an irrational choice to act, to take responsibility, and to ground the self in the infinite, despite the terror of the void. The self only becomes whole when it transparently acknowledges its strict, finite limitations, while simultaneously and actively embracing its infinite potential. Kierkegaard was a religious thinker, writing in a theological context, yet his architecture of the self laid the direct bedrock for 20th century secular psychoanalysis. Later thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre stripped away the theology but kept the psychological machinery. They adapted Kierkegaard's concepts of anxiety, bad faith, and the evasion of freedom to explain the modern human condition. The enduring lesson of existential psychology is a hard one. Anxiety is not a flaw to be medicated away. It is the necessary threshold of maturity. It is the essential friction we must cross to take ownership of our existence, and the only path away from the true sickness of despair.